Women have historically been subjected to abuse and punishment by men. In the rugged landscape of the Wild West, the prevailing patriarchy subjected women to enduring harsh punishments and inequalities, denying them the full freedoms and opportunities enjoyed by men in that era. The Apache tribe, like many Native American groups, found themselves entangled in conflicts with European settlers during the tumultuous Wild West era. As a result, they held women captives. These men did creepy things to women. What sinister methods did the Apache employ to chastise their female captives? These are the creepy things men have ever done to women in the Wild West. According to a narrative of a traveler of that era, the Indians quickly sprang into our wagons, filling the air with terrifying war cries and hideous shouts. The attack was a sudden and terrible apparition, without a moment's preparation or warning. A group of 250 Indians, painted and armed for war, raided a wagon train, taking prisoners and looted villages. These captives were forcibly thrust into a world alien to them, confronted with the ways of the Indian people, and this experience challenged their perceptions of civilization and savagery. Popular sentiment of the time dictated that Indian customs of hospitality should be shunned and that the Native Americans themselves were to be feared, despised, and displaced. The captivity experience, however, called these deeply ingrained social and cultural values into question. Removed from their familiar linguistic and societal norms, the female captives found themselves exposed to practices and beliefs that they had been taught to condemn as expressions of savagery. In the interest of survival, they reluctantly abandoned their established patterns and adopted new ones, which presented them with a profound intellectual dilemma. Travelers who ventured west of the Mississippi in the 19th century encountered a seemingly hostile and barren region, devoid of the comforting assurances of civilization and Christianity that were accustomed to in the East. While they feared their savage enemies, the settlers were often ill-prepared to face Indian aggression. Scattered settlements and vulnerable wagon trains provided little resistance to the raiding parties of the Great Plains, whose actions inflicted hardship and suffering upon captive white women. The attacks of Native American groups often unfolded swiftly, catching settlers off guard and ill-equipped to defend themselves. Women and children were frequently left alone and unattended, while men were occupied with essential tasks for their family's survival. These captives were often taken when the majority of men were absent, or even when none were on guard. Meeting little resistance, the raiding parties could easily make women their helpless victims. Once in the captors' hands, women were compelled to remove their European clothing and footwear, and many were separated from their children. These infants were often carried by the captors themselves or by young members of the tribe. The captives' experiences varied, from isolation to adoption into Indian families. They were thrust into the heart of Indian culture, their hands and knees often bearing the physical marks of the harsh terrain. You won't believe the horrible acts they perform on these helpless ladies, but we'll tell you. So sit tight. First and foremost, it's essential to understand that women taken captive by the Apache were often perceived as prized assets. They served a multitude of purposes, encompassing both sexual and labor roles. In some instances, female captives were integrated into Apache society as wives or concubines of warriors. These women were expected to carry out domestic duties and provide companionship to their captors. Nevertheless, a considerable number of captive women met a grim fate, being sold into slavery or traded to other tribes and European settlers. These transactions were not trifles. The Apache regularly exchanged captives for valuable commodities such as horses, firearms, or other goods. The value of female captives in particular was notable as they commanded high prices in the slave markets of Mexico and the American Southwest. The fear of sexual abuse was a significant aspect of Indian captivity, both in accounts written by redeemed captives and sensationalized narratives. It was widely feared that women captured by Indians were at risk of being subjected to the Indians' lust and that they would endure the most horrific personal outrages. Being assigned to serve as wives was also a concern. Many believed that they would be forced to perform the duties of a wife in addition to domestic work. White women were highly prized as captives for this reason. The prospect of becoming the sexual companion of an Indian was considered loathsome and repulsive, and women were terrified of being subjected to the Indians' lustful passions. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and please hit that like button. Captive women lived in fear of having to perform the assigned by Indian customs and be forced into sexual relations with Indian men. The idea of sharing the marital bed with an Indian man was especially distressing, and they anticipated and abhorred the Indians' lustful desires. While there was widespread fear that women would be subjected to sexual abuse, narratives suggest that actual incidents of rape were less common. The captives were often formally united with their captors before sexual relations began. These unions followed Indian customs, including ceremonies and rituals. However, once they were married, according to these customs, physical contact would begin, usually involving consummation of the marriage. While this seems traumatic to the captives, they were formally recognized as wives in Indian society before any physical contact occurred. For those unfortunate women who did not become slaves or wives, life as a captive was an unrelenting ordeal. They were subjected to physical and sexual abuse by their captors, often compelled to endure arduous journeys and harsh living conditions. Delving into the distressing specifics of Apache punishment methods, let's consider mutilation, the fourth most cruel technique on our list. Mutilation involved the gruesome act of severing body parts, including fingers, toes, ears, noses, and genitalia, often executed with knives or other sharp instruments. The victims, held down or restrained, suffered immense pain, while their tormentors took pleasure in inflicting suffering. This form of brutal punishment was intended not just to cause physical harm, but also to humiliate and debase the victim. Moreover, it served as a grim warning to any who might contemplate challenging the Apache, for they believed that mutilation would weaken the power of their adversaries and communicate their unwavering resolve. As distressing as mutilation was, the Apache had even more spine-chilling techniques in their arsenal. Among them was burning, the third method. This agonizing practice entailed tying the victim to a stake or post, then setting them ablaze. Such gruesome acts frequently occurred in full view of other captives or tribe members. The Apache's distinctive cruelty was evident in their presence for slow-burning fires, causing prolonged agony and suffering for the victims. To intensify the pain, they also employed torture fires, which involved heating metal objects such as branding irons before pressing them against the victim's skin. Burning was not merely about inflicting physical pain, it was a method designed to humiliate and degrade the victim further. Another form of mutilation was tattooing. The Mojaves tattooed women so that they could recognize them as their own in any tribe they might encounter. These tattoos served as a clear mark of belonging to the tribe and made it easier to identify them if they attempted to escape. According to Olive Oatman, the Apaches pricked the skin in small regular rows on our chins with a very sharp stick until they bled freely. The slashed parts of the face were then pricked once more with sticks dipped in the juice of a certain weed and bluestone powder. The permanently marked captives were thus discouraged from fleeing and encouraged to adopt an Indian lifestyle. Among the most harrowing practices used by the Apache was running the gauntlet, which involved forcing a captive to run between two rows of warriors. These warriors would brutally beat and strike the captive with weapons as they passed. While this was undoubtedly perilous and brutal, it pales in comparison to scalping, a truly horrifying practice. Scalping entailed the removal of a victim's scalp, often while they were still alive, using a knife or other sharp implement. The Apache believed that by scalping their enemies, they could seize their adversaries' power and courage. The act of scalping served as a symbol of victory and dominance, and the Apache often displayed the scalps as gruesome trophies. These scalps were sometimes adorned with feathers or beads, and the Apache would perform victory dances or chants around them, underscoring their domination. Yet another grim technique employed by the Apache was anting. In this tormenting method, the captives were tied to an anthill, either face up or face down, and left to endure the relentless bites and stings of ants. The Apache believed that the venom from these ant bites would gradually lead to the captive's demise, serving as a befitting punishment for their perceived enemies. The victims were left bound to the anthill for several hours or even days, depending on the severity of the punishment. During this excruciating ordeal, they would suffer not only from the ant attacks, but also from exposure to the elements, leading to dehydration and hunger. In examining these distressing historical practices, it becomes evident that the Apache's treatment of captive women was a chilling reflection of the harsh realities of the Wild West era. The methods they employed were not only physically excruciating, but also designed to humiliate, degrade, and exert dominance over their captives. These historical accounts underscore the severe toll that intertribal conflicts and colonization took on individuals, particularly women, during this tumultuous period in history. What are your thoughts about this? Please let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more interesting videos.